This video is brought to you by Nebula. Yemen has been in the news a lot recently, mainly because the Houthis, who control most of the country's east, have been attacking maritime traffic passing through the Red Sea. But while most of the media's attention has been focused on the impact it might have on global shipping, the current crisis in the Red Sea is also worrying because it risks restarting Yemen's civil war, which has been on hold since a ceasefire was negotiated between the Houthis and the Saudi-backed and internationally recognised Yemeni government in April 2022. Despite subsequent pause in high-level conflict, Yemen is still considered one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with over 20 million people, or about 70% of the population, currently in need of humanitarian assistance. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Yemen's civil war, how the Red Sea crisis jeopardizes its fragile peace, and how it could end. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, the first thing to understand about Yemen is that it's basically been beset by sectarian violence for most of modern history. Before unification in 1990, Yemen was split into two states, South Yemen and North Yemen. South Yemen originated with the British Protectorate of Aden. The British captured the port of Aden in the 19th century because they thought the port was in a strategically advantageous location. While Britain's other outposts in the Middle East, such as Egypt, Palestine or the Gulf, were mandates or protectorates, Aden was its only Arab colony, i.e. directly ruled by the British Crown. The surrounding area, which was mostly sparsely populated desert, was governed by local tribes, but overseen by the British as the Aden Protectorate, and the boundaries of the Aden Protectorate basically map onto what would become South Yemen. South Yemen achieved independence from the British in the 1960s, and promptly turned into a Marxist-Leninist one-party state led by a group called the National Liberation Front. This made South Yemen, then known as People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, the only avowedly communist nation in the Middle East, and it received significant foreign aid and assistance from the Soviet Union. North Yemen also came into being as a state during the 60s, when local Arab revolutionaries staged a coup against King Mohammed al-Badr, whose family had taken power after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and established the Yemen Arab Republic, with Sana'a as its capital. Neither Yemen was able to achieve political stability. On top of the two wars between the two Yemens in 1972 and 1979, both countries were beset by civil war. South Yemen remained appallingly poor for decades after independence, and in 1986, after a prolonged period of political instability, the ruling Yemeni Socialist Party collapsed into a civil war, which ended up killing thousands of Yemenis. In North Yemen, Zaidi tribes in the northern areas were constantly fighting against the Sunni populations in the coastal and southern regions. Ironically, these tribes, who were supported by Saudi Arabia, would go on to become the Houthis. Successive presidents were either ousted or assassinated until the arrival of President Ali Abdullah Saleh in 1978. With the help of an extensive patronage system, Saleh was able to hold on to power until unification in 1990, when he became president of Yemen. During unification, North Yemen essentially subsumed South Yemen, which was both poorer, less populated, and politically weakened by the 1986 crisis. One of the motivations for the merger was the discovery of oil fields in the Marib in North Yemen and Shabwa in South Yemen, and the hope that cooperation could help both countries more effectively develop their oil fields. Anyway, for the first decade or so after unification, Yemen remained very poor. This was, in part, because corruption undermined the budding oil industry, but also because, in November 1990, just 6 months after unification, Yemen voted against UN Resolution 678, condemning Saddam Hussein. This didn't go down well with Yemen's Arab neighbours, including Saudi Arabia or the West. Under the George H.W. Bush administration, the US immediately cut $70 million in aid funding and pressured other states to do the same, which meant that Yemen received very little humanitarian aid relative to its poverty level. A few years later, Yemen applied to the Gulf Cooperation Council, a political and economic union comprising Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in an attempt to improve its economic prospects, but was duly rejected. By 2001, Yemen had learned from its mistakes. After 9/11, Yemen immediately offered its full support to the US in fighting terrorism. Yemen leader Saleh was one of the first people to be invited to Washington, and Yemen received millions of dollars in development aid and military aid for fighting al-Qaeda. In 2002, Yemen was allowed to join certain GCC-adjacent institutions, and in 2007, it began negotiations for full membership. GDP per capita, which had flatlined at about $400 for the decade after unification, began to increase, reaching a peak of over $1,500 in 2014. Unfortunately, things only went downhill from there. As part of the Arab Spring in 2011, protests across Yemen forced Saleh to finally stand down and hand over power to his deputy Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi. While Hadi was originally quite popular, he was constantly undermined by the army and security services, who were still loyal to Saleh, and was unable to stem the constant factional infighting during the transition. In 2014, he proposed a new federal Yemen, divided into 6 states. But this was soundly rejected by the Houthis because the region that included the Houthis' heartland had access neither to the Red Sea nor any oil fields. As we mentioned earlier, the Houthis emerged from the Zaidi tribes and named themselves after the al-Houthi brothers, who led a Zaidi rebellion against Saleh's government in the 2000s after Saleh signed a controversial border deal with Saudi Arabia. Anyway, this sparked a full-blown war between the Hadi government and the Houthis. We're not going to go into too much detail here, but the TLDR is that the Houthis basically won, and today control most of Yemen's populated areas. This was for at least 3 reasons. First, they were supported by Iran, in part because Zaydism is a form of Shia Islam. Second, they were actually pretty well received by many Yemenis in North Yemen, who'd become fed up with the corruption of the Yemeni government. And third, while both Saudi Arabia and the UAE opposed the Houthis, they supported different anti-Houthi factions. Saudi Arabia supported Hadi's government, while the UAE backed the Southern Transitional Council, or STC, a separatist group that wants the South to secede, basically reversing the unification we saw in 1990. For context, there's always been a sense in much of South Yemen that they've been neglected by the more powerful North, and there were separatist movements in the mid-90s and late 2000s. Hadi and the STC were originally allies, but in early 2018 the STC split from Hadi and started fighting against government forces. After taking control of Aden and most of southern Yemen's populated centres, they declared autonomous rule in the south in 2020. Hostilities were put on pause in April 2022 when they both joined the Saudi-led Presidential Leadership Council and signed a ceasefire with the Houthis. But in the past few months, the leader of the STC, General Idris al-Zubaydi, has accused the Saudis of sidelining the STC in negotiations with the Houthis and has restarted advocating for southern independence. So, could this happen? Could Yemen split once again? Well, it looks unlikely, at least in the immediate future. Neither the Houthis nor Hadi and the Saudis want Yemen to split, and all hope to one day regain control over the entire territory. And even if the STC are the major player in southern Yemen, they don't have a monopoly of control like the Houthis sort of do in North Yemen, in part because Saudi Arabia have tried to undermine Zubaydi's calls by encouraging tribes in the south to push for their own independence. It's also worth saying that South Yemen didn't really function very well as an independent state before unification, and it would be constantly threatened by the Houthis and terrorist groups like al-Qaeda operating in the deserts nearby. On the other hand, though, the South has never really been happy in its union with the North, as evidenced by the recurring separatist violence we saw in the 90s and 2000s. Also, given the trajectory of the war, a single unified Yemen would almost definitely be controlled by the Houthis, which is something the South is understandably wary of. If the Saudis eventually accept that a unified state would be a Houthi state, they might decide that Yemen's disunion is the least bad option, especially if the Saudi-Iran relationship develops to the point that they can convince Tehran to reduce support for the Houthis. All in all, while South Yemen still seems a distant prospect, a unified Yemen also looks pretty unlikely, given the disagreements between the Houthis and the Saudis, which means there's always a chance. You've no doubt been following along with the news from Israel and Gaza, but if you want a better understanding, to dive deeper into the history of the region, then you should check out Real Life Law's hour-long documentary about the tensions and fighting between Israel and Gaza going back decades. That video, by the way, is part of Real Life Law's Modern Conflict series, where they regularly run through major ongoing conflicts from Lebanon's civil war to everything going on in Myanmar and the Turkish-Kurdish conflict. It's an incredible series and it's exclusively available on our streaming service, Nebula. As you likely know, Nebula is the service we built with a bunch of our creator friends, and is the home to tons of smart educational content from all your favourite creators. The best part is that by signing up, you not only get access to exclusive series like Modern Conflicts, China Actually from Polymatter, or The Logistics of X from Wendover Productions, it also directly supports TLDR. That's because when you sign up, you contribute to the budgets of these big budget documentaries, and it helps us grow and expand our ambitions. So if you sign up using the link below, you can support us directly and get 40% off Nebula's annual plan. That's less than £2 a month, which is an incredibly good price for an independent streaming service which not only supports creators but also provides you with tons of ad-free and exclusive content. Thank you for your support and for backing Nebula.